the story is skewed in such a way that it was like, oh, okay, the blacks have overcome the whites, which is not what majority rule is about. Majority rule is about the democratic process of one man, one vote, and those that get the majority
I disagree
wins.
with you. I disagree with you. I see where you're coming from, because don't forget, women didn't have the right to vote. You had the land vote, and we moved on to that. 62 was an election where we had universal
suffrage,
and then we went on to 67. But in the political world, that is being skewed as a very racially charged day.
I got you.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
No, and we need to make sure that
we went from there. Okay, we went from there to a period where 68, and then I think the UBP had 4 or 6 people in Parliament. Majority of them were white, and from periods in there, it was a very racially charged time.
Welcome, everybody. We want to welcome you to this exciting episode of the Butler Legacy podcast. I'm excited, Loretta, to be here again to record, another one of these fantastic episodes with such tremendous guests.
Oh, I am excited. I believe this is going to be pretty great today. I am so happy that my former colleague is in the house. I'm so happy that his brother, your business partner, just these generational, we haven't identified who they are yet today, but this is going to be really exciting. Thank you so much. Great to see you again. We've had a little break.
We have had a little break, but it's good to be back here. And so before we start, we just want to say a special shout out to our sponsors. Of course, the Echo Current here at Bahamas for sponsoring this Legacy podcast, as well as the Butler Legacy Foundation. Thank you guys for continuing to believe in us and just telling stories of Bahamian families. And as we said when we started these podcasts, our hope is to inspire other families as they hear about the legacy of Samilo and Lady Caroline to think about their own legacies and what they can do to have impact and inspiration as we celebrate particularly the 50th anniversary of independence of our country. So Loretta, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce and welcome our special guest.
Well, first of all, hold on. I got to tell you, these podcasts have been so interesting. The response that we have gotten from the public in general has been amazing because, it's not so much just about the history, but it's those little unknown stories that we share so intimately in these conversational settings that really piques people's interest. And that is why I'm so excited about today, because we have in the house here at the Echo Gallery 2 exciting, distinguished Bahamian men in their own rights, whom I'm happy to say that I do know. First of all, we have our former Deputy Prime Minister, the illustrious Mr. Is he illustrious?
Absolutely, he is.
Okay. Brent Symonette in the house. Yes,
Thank you.
He's amazing.
Welcome, Brent.
Thank you very much. Welcome to be here.
And of course, we have his brother.
Yes.
They're funny because, Brent wants to say that he's younger, but no, we have Craig in the house, who you have worked with so closely on so many levels.
Yes, Craig has been a bit of a mentor to me. We served on several boards together. Obviously a serial entrepreneur and somebody who my father had a long-standing relationship with, both these gentlemen, particularly Craig. So delighted to have you join us, Craig, as well.
Thank you, Franklin.
And
Thank you,
the
Loretta.
significance of having the Symonettes, I was saying off air, that when Brent introduced me to Frontline Politics in 2001, officially, there was this big sort of gasp. But what people did not realize at the time is that the relationship with the Symonettes and the Butler goes back generations. And so we're so delighted to have them here today to be able to share their story, their recollections of, our grandfather, our great-grandmother, their father, their mother, and so on and so forth. So welcome, gentlemen. We are so happy to have you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta.
So, to Loretta's point, As I understand it, Brent, maybe you tell me, or maybe I should ask Craig's, being that you're the older brother.
Oh.
My understanding is this relationship. Let's talk about where this relationship started. As I understand it, Samilo's mother, Frances Butler, a member of Ebenezer Church. The irony of that. And I understand who was probably the only black woman to sit in the front seat at Ebenezer Church, which was, I guess, a novel idea at that time when the Bahamas certainly wasn't as inclusive and integrated as it is today, but always drew on your father. The stories in our family is that Frances Butler could call Sir Roland at any time to support any of her community initiatives. What are your recollections of that relationship?
Well, you're right. I certainly remember, especially the fairs and when it came time to get rid of the coffee and the cakes and the leftover foods, they would always go to Samilo's mother.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'd take them together. I drove the Ford Falcon and my father would help distribute it. I think that basically because, you got to remember the two gentlemen grew up a mile apart from each other, lived their lives a mile apart from each other. I'd have to say that there's a strong connotation that part of that was due to that area being in Shirlea, which was the area our father represented in Parliament, but really just because of good friendship too. And just to tell you a funny story of it, my father told me once that he was asked he would always go and buy everything left over on the table at the time that the requests would come. And he said, one time he said that he couldn't give the coffee away because I had no cups and everything at the time. And so he said, well, let me take the coffee down to the shipyard and give it to the watchman. And he had a few sandwiches with it. The watchman looked at him and said, well, Sir Roland, I'll take the sandwiches, but that coffee, it might keep me awake. And then was the watchman saying that.
Exactly.
So ironic.
So we blame that one on your great-grandmother.
Yes.
No, I think Craig was right. Certainly I remember when we switched sides, because our dad used to go to Ebenezer, because he was born a Methodist next to the Methodist church in Current Luther. Then we moved to Nassau. Ebenezer was his home church, was our home church for a long time. And yeah, I remember we switched sides. One day we would sit at the front at the right, and we end up sitting at the front at the left.
I just wanted you to bring clarity to that about switching
sides. I agree.
Because that could be political
the church. They have sides too. No, in the front row in Ebenezer. And that was a time when it was recognized that what you're saying in terms of integration happened, and Dad and your grandmother were in line with that, and I think they probably orchestrated it.
Well, just to, give context to this, I mean, we dance around this issue, but it's so important that we actually talk about it. Our grandmother was Black. Black people were not generally allowed to sit there.
Correct.
At the front. They had to use a different entrance and so on and so forth. She was a maverick. She was a pioneer, obviously. Sir Roland concurred. He was a very powerful man, not only being the representative, as Craig has said, for the city, but, even within his church community, he was very, very integral, very strong member of the Methodist Church. And so there had to be some collusion agreement to allow this Black woman to have such a prominent position in the church.
Let me just interject so we sort of get a little idea of the balance. When Dad first ran for Parliament in 1935, he nominated on 13th of March, which happened to be the day he died, which happened to be the day I nominated, but it just happens that day.
Wow, that is interesting.
They thought he was going to nominate in Nassau. And the powers that be were not in favor of the old man nominating. The powers that be in 1935 were not in favor of R.T. Symonette running for Parliament. So in those days, you nominated in different times in different islands. So in the middle of the night, he jumps on his boat, sails to Louthra, and nominates for Harbour Island, and leaves the powers that be holding the bag in Nassau, waiting for him to come. So don't always assume that R.T. Symonette was the favorite or part of that set of people.
I got you.
Wow, that is amazing.
Interesting.
See, and
He then moved to Nassau in the next election in the Eastern District, which happened to be Montague for you and me, and then subsequently St. Anne's.
Okay.
Well, that is important for us to know because once again, it shows his ingenuity in being able to understand the political landscape as well. And, so when you put all of this together and you realize, hey, maybe he was not always the favorite person, and maybe he had an understanding of the underdog.
Absolutely. And I think maybe that's probably some of the commonality that we probably have through multiple generations, this idea of being rebels. And I see that in a positive way. This idea that,
But he won that election.
I'm sure he did, right? But the reality is this whole idea of, recognizing that while we have differences, we've got to be able to rebel within a context, within these systems of governance, whether that's political parties or whether that's, in the church, to make sure that people recognize that at the end of the day, progress comes at some type of price.
It does. And I think that is what makes these two families, especially when you look at the pioneering spirit. People would talk about, how Sir Roland did this and did that to be recognized as a merchant, how Sir Milo did the same. But they both shared a very mutual understanding of building where there was strength in business. Sir Roland took one route, Sir Milo took another. But at the end of the day, they were both trailblazers in their respective businesses.
No question about that. I think that's pretty well documented.
But also at a time that, don't forget, in politics, you weren't paid. So the salaries as cabinet ministers and parliamentarians came a lot longer down the road. So when they, in 1935 and in the years when Sir Milo and our father did it, that was, you would go to the House of Assembly at 8:15 at night.
That is correct. After work.
After work.
After work.
So get this right.
And you were in a round table. There was no political parties. You had senior member and junior member.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, because the political parties only came into existence in the late 50s.
That's right.
So for a long time, and you also had a British governor.
Understood.
So don't forget, it wasn't like, we didn't have independence then. So it was Legislative Council and Executive Council, the House of Assembly. And people were elected there. And like Bobby, when he was in Exuma, he was with Freddie Brown.
Correct.
The two members there.
Yeah.
So it wasn't politics as such.
I got you.
So you could get two different fellows from one constituency.
Understood. So let's talk about it. I think this is a great transition point to talk about, particularly Sir Roland and Sir Milo from a political perspective. And we hear so many stories of obviously Sir Roland being the premier of the Bahamas. Sir Milo obviously would have been, one of the champions of the majority rule and movement. What do you recall of that relationship of Sir Milo and Sir Roland in particular, particularly from a political House of Assembly perspective?
I think there was always the appearance of opposition or different views. Loretta can attest to it just as easy as I can. You get in the House of Assembly and you stand up there and you throw some serious blows at each other. You go in the smoker's room and you break bread together and crack jokes.
Yeah.
While you might have differences of ideology or whatever you want to, there was a common ground that both of that, certainly those two men, respected they were doing the best they could for the common good of everyone in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
I think that's true. But, there was also more collegiality, genteel relationships outside of the political arena. I think that, when people, and the general public, they sort of say this a lot. Oh, you see those people in the House of Assembly, killing each other, but they're best friends. I think it's a lot more than that. You've got to be able to respect individuals for what they bring and their views.
Yeah.
I believe that a lot of people who are not in politics believe that we should be mortal enemies on
absolutely.
all levels. And obviously that's not going to work. We're a very small population. We have to interact together. We have to do business together. We cannot be mortal enemies in our social environments.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is best brought out by Sir Lyndon's tribute speech to our father when he was retiring after 54 years. Sir Lyndon stood up and said, well, Sir Roland, we wish you well in your future career. We've had bitter arguments in this house, disagreed vehemently on many, many points of view, but it never degraded to the personal.
Absolutely.
And I think that sums it up best. That they had a lot of mutual respect. I mean, as Franklin knows, our family never had any business dealings with the Pendleton family, but we certainly had many, many business dealings with the Butler family that all originated with Sir Milo and Sir Roland.
Right.
And then graduated from there.
But, even interestingly enough, Mrs. Pindling has spoken about the fact that your mother,
Yes.
your mother actually, and them demitting office and, Pindling and Mrs. Pindling coming into office. I think she talked about how your mother actually helped to groom her and encourage her and tell her, about different aspects of the office. And I think that, from an historical standpoint, if we talk about being at our 50-year legacy, there is no way that we can have people that are opposed to each other at political levels not being collegial or, respectful to persons on the other side in a social environment. So that says a lot about your mother as well.
Yeah.
And obviously that was something that Sir Roland felt, should have happened as well, I imagine.
I think if you look back on it, possibly politics has gone too far adversarial, and it's no longer. It's a nasty fight out there. I mean,
It is.
You've
is.
experienced it.
That's
and,
right. When it begins to attack you personally, that is when it becomes a real heartbreaker for me.
Whether it's your own political party, in your case, when you ran for leadership, and in the middle of the night, you felt the heat of what the heat was.
Absolutely.
Or whether it's adversary, against parties. I think hopefully maybe in the next election or wherever we can get on better keel.
I think friendly fire is worse than enemy fire.
Well, one comes from the front.
That's the point. Exactly. That's probably the thing. Yeah. One from the back is more dangerous. Yeah.
But fundamentally, with Brent and I talking on this and, with Craig, expanding, I think it's so important that when we look in the context of this legacy podcast and what we want to achieve and how we want to frame a Bahamas for the next 50 years, there are those of us who have been in the fray, who no longer need to be in the fray, that we need to help, I believe, to mentor those values that our parents and grandparents espoused.
Yes.
No question about it.
But don't forget, there's a lot of commonality between Sir Milo and our father in that they were self-made people.
Absolutely.
Our father was the youngest of 9. Really started off farming, sailing gradually, but it wasn't like the 4 of us who inherited something.
Absolutely.
They started off from the real
From the ground up.
Yeah.
And they both fought their fights in different areas in business. And Sir Milo became an icon in the pond. I mean that's a pity the building's not there anymore.
Absolutely.
We should have saved that.
Totally
agree. That's another story.
But that's all a part of this legacy. What we need to impart to this generation. There are too many people, as Uncle Frank used to say, that are part of the microwave.
Instant society.
The instant society. People look at Craig Symonette, they look at Brent Symonette, they look at Franklin, and they say, "Oh, I want to be like that." But they don't understand that even with an inheritance, there is a struggle. They don't understand the story that the Sir Milos, that the Sir Rolands actually went through to achieve what they achieved. They did not start out with a lot. They pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. They were disciplined. They always had the church at the center of their lives.
That's for sure.
And many times we lose focus on those sort of intangibles that are so important to building the character of these men. And that's why these men are legendary. And that's why it's important that we continue to share their lessons with the next generations.
I had the opportunity the other day or Robin, my wife, actually read them to me. Some of my old man's, our father's, love letters to our mother. And he was talking in 1945 about shipping tomatoes to Canada.
Interesting.
And in those days, there wasn't... Craig would call them reefers. Or
Exactly.
There was no refrigerated containers,
yeah.
and the boat didn't make it, or the weather was bad, and how the tomatoes were going to rotten. So, I mean, this was the whole thing, or bananas from the down south or
From Haiti.
or where they
Beside
went
Domingo.
in.
Yeah.
We had boats going to Jamaica, Latin America, and so on and so forth. That was, people probably don't know of that type of history. Or you go to the store in the pond and used to buy leaf tobacco.
Yeah.
I remember by the pound.
I remember
and,
that.
and kerosene.
And kerosene.
pump it out.
Kerosene oil.
And I get pump it out.
And sometimes it spills all over you
and
while
you
you're
smell like-
pumping it.
yeah.
Well, let's talk about the ice factory.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
I
right.
can
Not
remember
bad.
in the shipyard, the big bandsaws, because at that time they were building ships, used to create a lot of sawdust.
Yeah.
And of course, all the sawdust went out to the ice factory to cover the ice, and it was
The
a great
ice house.
insulation.
That's
Ice
right.
house.
That's
right.
right.
That's right.
Ice
That's
house,
right.
yeah.
And it's like I said, these historical points are so important because people do not realize that when you're beginning a journey of entrepreneurship, it starts at the bottom.
No question about it.
No
question.
And there are stairs that have to be taken each step at a time. There is no fast, quick way of getting to the top.
Yeah.
But going back to farming and the scale of farming in those days, in the same letters that Brent's referring to, I can remember Sir Roland writing about 40,000 cases of pineapples from Cat Island.
Wow.
Now, very few people think of Cat Island as a
farming-
a pineapple place. They think of
Eleuthera.
more Eleuthera.
Yeah.
But they thought nothing of that size of crop. And nowadays, we've gone backwards in many ways.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
When you compare to what used to be.
Well, I
Now,
remember
of course, we have competition with reefer and chilled and faster ships from the United States and
But
the,
don't
great
forget, we
great
had,
enormity
we
of
had
the American
Sawyer's
farming market.
pigeon peas. And I
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
they went out of business because it was cheaper to get pigeon peas from Ghana.
Absolutely, and important.
Yeah.
And that's something
Yeah.
we're focusing today. We're not farming as much as we should do.
Yeah.
Tomatoes in South Eleuthera, wherever.
Yeah.
And so we talk about, and now it's interesting, government talks about being self-reliant.
Yes.
And an egg farm and so on and so forth. Hopefully part of this podcast is we have to then convince others that farming or certain careers are,
dignified.
that's a good word.
Dignified.
Yeah. In other words,
They're
there's nothing
dignified
wrong
ways.
with being a farmer or whatever.
Some of the wealthiest people in the world, and we know some of them right here, farmed peanuts,
Yep.
to make it. But I'm really proud of the fact that even in the Symonette family, you see the generational transition of farming tomatoes.
Yep.
Because today, even though the methodology has changed,
Yeah.
you see the Lucayan tropical nurseries today produce, and let me, for context, you see that where Cameron
Yep.
and that third generation or fourth generation of Symonettes is expanding on the technology of producing tomatoes and everything for our market.
Definitely.
And, we're so proud that we can go into the supermarkets and get these wonderful fresh produce, which is also important for the health of our nation.
No question about it. No question about it.
That's true.
But it's also been a battle, Craig would be better to tell you, of getting those tomatoes on the front shelf of the food store too. Because a lot of times we want imported.
Yeah.
It has to come over the bar.
Well, this.
And we're not, like I got some tomatoes the other day from BAIC, a nice box of tomatoes for $20 or whatever.
Yeah.
They have taste.
Yeah.
Some of these ones that
You import.
some food stores sell don't have any taste.
Yeah. So I want to just transition us. I think this point of agriculture and entrepreneurship is one area. But if we think about Sir Milo, Sir Roland being political emissaries, and then we now have this partnership that we have as families, I think there are a lot of Bahamians who struggle about this race divide, and they see the politics and the acrimony that comes with the banter that comes in the public domain. What can be done? Sir Milo was, as I know it, very intentional. I suspect Sir Roland, if we think about how we became partners with you guys in Commonwealth Bank and other investments, there was this willingness to open the door. What can we do? How can we demonstrate for other Bahamians who are looking to bridge this racial divide or this perception that, one race has more opportunities than the other? Certainly we have found a way to bridge that. And I think there's some lessons perhaps that we should be able to share with others around what we can do to make sure that we continue to bridge these.
That's a very good question. And I want to go back to one of your former podcasts because I very much enjoyed listening to Sir Franklin Wilson talk about that very point.
Yeah.
And I think I'm talking now about one of the organizations I think went a long way to doing this, was the YPO group,
Right.
Young Presidents Organization. It was brought to this country by Sir John Templeton.
Right.
And Sir Franklin Wilson was paramount in bringing it to us.
Yeah.
Now, your father and I were members at the time. I'm going back to the early 80s. So Franklin Wilson was very instrumental in founding it.
Correct.
But to your point of bringing people together, that's how I really got to know Bradley Roberts, Bismarck Coakley, so many persons at that time. The Sunshine Group were developing new businesses. Mr. Finlayson.
Yep.
And we all went to each other's houses for every quarter. We went out to dinner at someone else's house. And at that time, it went a long way to bringing people together. Don't forget the Sir Lyndon's government had just come in 10 years before. I'm talking back in the day. And I felt, in my way of answering your question, that that organization did a lot to start to bring us together at a business level.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that's where I certainly got to know your father very well. Because we had fun together. It wasn't meeting in a boardroom.
Exactly.
We went to Andros, to the Vortec base.
Yep.
We toured Eleuthera for 2 days. Zuma we went. Andros. Crooked Island. We did a trip to Crooked Island.
Yeah.
Where your family has interests.
Yep.
And so there's lots of answers to it, but I'd be interested to hear what Brent has to say about this. But in my mind, I attribute it. One of the organizations that went a long way was the Young Presidents Organization.
I agree.
Yeah. Interesting.
Another one that on pure business was probably Commonwealth Bank.
Yep.
For many people who don't know the history of Commonwealth Bank, it was started by a Canadian company that owned 71% of the bank.
Yep.
And it was actually a relative of our mother's.
That's right.
I didn't know that.
Canadian National Bank of whatever, I forget. Laurentide Bank and
Laurentine Finance in Canada.
Company in Canada,
Yeah.
which is a very large. Anyway, it came down here. It started basically the higher purchases we know, and National Bank of Canada, as it was then, wrote our mother and said, we're moving out, we're selling out. Let us know by 3:00 today or something. It was a very,
short time.
Interesting.
It was. I mean, it really was a
short
I don't know if it was 3 hours, but it was certainly short. And Craig, Mum, and I had lunch together, and we just said, okay, fine, we're going to buy it. And that was the start. And then, of course, Bobby and Craig and I got together, and Mum, and then we started figuring out, okay, we've got to make this bank work.
Yep.
So this group didn't have deep pockets in terms of the Royal Bank or the CIBC or those. So we had to do two things. And I'm going to take a little bit of time so a lot of people understand where this comes from. One was to raise the money to buy the bank.
Yep.
And one was to put money in the bank for cash in the bank.
Right.
Got you.
So we sold off blocks of $105,000. $52,500 went to buying the shares in the bank, and $52,500 went to putting money in the bank.
Interesting.
So that was the first step. That's how. Then we all sat down and said, okay, where do we go from here? And the idea was to get people on board with us who are obviously similar ideas and whatever, but not only car dealers, real estate agents, all the different business professions, but all the different ethnic groups, all the different whatever. So you create a kaleidoscope.
I got you.
And I know there's some people, well, actually the guy I'm thinking of right now is no longer with us, but he borrowed money to buy the shares and he became quite a successful insurance magnate. And you get people like Junior Roberts and Craig and I who are on both sides of the divide, where we had real estate transactions, where we had need for selling land and financing as well. And then it started, and that's how Commonwealth Bank was started.
Interesting.
I wrote the purchase check. It was $4 million something and 71 cents. And I remember I put only and signed the check. And now it's
I love that.
only.
Yeah.
But your father, Franklin, was one of the first to
Exactly.
respond.
That's he
interesting.
was.
Your
no
father
question.
and Sherwin Thompson,
a number
Reno
of people.
Brown.
Yeah.
Yes,
And hence Frankie became on the board then,
Yes.
on the original board with a number of us.
Yeah.
And that is so important for perspective.
Yeah.
Because we hear the story constantly of the Sunshine Boys,
Yep.
YPO, and their successes in those arenas. But Commonwealth Bank, and your mother, he did not mention Sir Roland.
Yeah.
That tells you the importance
But he was dead.
Of the maternal factors.
Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
The mother and the sons and their brother came together and determined they're going to do this. And they integrated in a very, very tangible way many aspects of our social personalities.
Yep.
Blacks, whites, browns, however they want to describe
Absolutely.
themselves, business persons. That is, to Commonwealth Bank's credit, that has to be historically noted, because I don't think we pay a close attention
and
to
a number
that.
of other businesses, Bahamas first, and followed suit,
Absolutely.
J.S. Johnson, and
That's
then you
right.
got the stages with IPOs, initial
management
public
buyouts,
and management. So that was the beginning of that stage where you started the expansion of the economy.
That's right.
From wherever it was to where, unfortunately,
From what we call the oligarchs,
Yeah.
To
Sole
more
proprietorship.
inclusion.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
is important, because you remember now, even when we look at the historical perspective, Sir Milo, being a merchant, would have to go to Parliament, and of course you had Sir Pritchard, and
Yep,
the
say Sir Pritchard.
the differences we had there in politics overlapping business. But this was a landmark investment,
No question.
where people of all diversifications, once they could have afforded it,
Yeah.
were included.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. And so the point of YPO and Commonwealth Bank historically are very, very important in the history of the Bahamas.
let me just inject in there one issue. When the group took over Commonwealth Bank, they struck a blow at the traditional 4 banks that were in this country.
That's right. Those Canadian banks.
And at one point, remember, we had there was a difficult period there. I remember Frankie and Bobby and Craig and a number of us, and we actually did a series of cartoons.
Okay.
One of them was Will Your Anchor Hold. Remember, there were a number of them. They're in the boardroom at Commonwealth Bank at the moment, or they used to be when I was there. And so that they had to take that fight on as well, because the Commonwealth Bank at that point, and still is the leader in banking for Bahamians.
Wow.
Without question. And, even with the back and forth today with, and we can be very, very frank here, no pun intended. The reality is this: when you look at the leverage that the external foreign banks now sort of have over the Bahamas, and they're offering less services, and they're doing the least that they possibly can to optimize their returns. And you look at a Commonwealth Bank, and I tell people all the time, I said, you know what? You still get personalized service in Commonwealth Bank. You can still talk to someone that's locally inhabiting the Bahamas. And so that is very, very important. And we're so happy that it is the Bahamian Bank.
This is not a paid
This is not a
economic
this is not a paid ad.
It's not a paid
This is
ad.
not a paid ad. But this is the truth.
Absolutely.
And that is important. So this speaks to the legacy of Bahamian ownership and
They
integration.
went on to, Craig, I'm out of my depth on this one, but Craig and Frankie would be talk about AML.
Correct.
And that was another
Yep.
step where the same type of format was used. And
Yes, but just before leaving Commonwealth, because I think this is an important part of our legacy together.
Absolutely.
I attribute your father, Franklin, was a very conservative person.
For sure.
Going back to the previous
Very conservative.
podcast, which I've enjoyed, we talked about lending and don't borrow and all this type of
absolutely.
thing. And I can remember during the early days, in the late 80s, 90s, your father always had keep these ratios on the conservative side, keep on the conservative side. And that reflects the way he lived his life.
Absolutely.
And
But he also
really a
wanted-
lot of the success of the very positive, should we say, current ratios of the bank and liquidity ratios of the bank are very strong. I attribute that in many ways to Franklin Butler.
Interesting.
You're very insistent on it.
But he's
and
also-
I didn't want to lose that point.
Thank you.
Thank you
But he
very
was
much.
also a pioneer. He wanted to do trust services for Bahamians.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because
so
that was an area
he
that-
certainly pushed the
and
first
he really
Bahamian credit
pushed-
card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the credit cards,
Yeah.
which was
Yeah.
areas that were not open.
Yeah.
Generally to Bahamians. Yeah.
But he was a great addition to Commonwealth Bank, and we miss him.
Yeah.
Very humble.
Thank you.
I miss him at the end of the AGMs. He'd always stand up and thank the staff.
Absolutely.
And he had a good rapport with people. He was a nice, gentle man.
Yeah.
We really appreciate you guys sharing those very intimate aspects of Uncle Frank, who, in my opinion, really took the brunt of all of the challenges the Butler businesses had when Granddaddy was in full throttle, in politics. Because, in politics, it's not a matter, back then, it was more giving from the politician. Today, it seems, a little different. But, Sir Milo, Sir Roland, and persons of that era were not in politics for what they got personally, because it really cost them a lot of money to be in politics. It was always about... So the Butler business, when Uncle Frank inherited it, was not as fluid
as it
should have been, because Sir Milo was always giving.
Absolutely. It was a cost.
Yes, it was a huge cost and sacrifice.
Socially, economically, on your family.
Yeah. No question.
And so we're really happy to know that Uncle Frank really, took that by the reins and was able to build upon what he did and to make a difference.
I think a lot of political pundits today would disagree with you, that it was a real cost being in politics. And I'm going back, I want to make it clear, not in the 2000s, in the 70s to the... these gentlemen all got into politics because they were in business.
Understood.
They weren't great politicians. They were there because they were in business.
Interesting.
And as the country grew, which it grew tremendously from the 50s to the, however you want to measure these things, to what we have today, their businesses grew.
Interesting.
But you can't blame them for being in politics for the businesses growing. They made the businesses grow.
Absolutely.
Because they brought foreign investment in and all the things we had.
Well, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
It's a mixture of the two, I think, is where you'd come out.
I agree.
But I think we also have to look at one thing that gets missed in a lot, and I think in one of your podcasts we talk about the history of the Bahamas. I think we really need to write an unvarnished,
history,
unpolitical or non-political history of the Bahamas that says A is A and B is B.
Yep.
Because when you go back, and if you go back way back, we have the usual comments. But for instance, in 1964 was the first step towards independence.
Yep.
We got internal self-government. Well, you started with political parties, but then you got internal self-government. Where the Bahamas had a premier for the first time, and ministerial government. We had every department of government apart from a couple, which was foreign affairs, police, and some others.
Yep.
And that came on board in 1967. So we had a two-step before we went to independence.
Correct.
And a lot of people might not remember that. So before 64, you had people like Bobby and Norman Solomon, and those were on the board of tourism. They didn't have a ministry of tourism.
I got you.
And you had, so a lot of things started as boards.
Got you.
And we then developed from boards into ministries, and then so on.
And that is important, because I believe also what we lose in that conversation is, how did we transition to this independence? Were the British helping us? And, it's interesting because I was at a talk recently where Sir Franklin and Sean McQueenie had a discussion at the University of the Bahamas. And Sean McQueenie said quite poignantly that in hindsight, he probably got it wrong with regards to the British involvement in enhancing our ability to be independent and what they brought to the table. And so, yes, in the historical perspective, everything began in 1967.
Right.
When in fact it didn't.
Correct.
And I think we've got to give credit, really, to Sir Roland as the premier of internal governance and the development, setting the platform for us to be able to get to 1967 and 73.
But also building on, don't forget, in the Commonwealth, there was the winds of change. Britain was getting rid of her colonies.
Yeah.
Jamaica went independent. A number of the African colonies went independent. So there was a change in attitude in Britain, in London. So it was just a matter of time before this progressed.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like we jumped up one morning and said, let's have independence.
Yeah. So, Brent, this is a good question.
It sort of built on
the foundations
because I
that
remember certainly our father saying, it was very difficult working under the governors, because don't forget, in those days the governor had the final say.
Yep.
And if the governor didn't like what legislative council said or exco said, the governor did what he wanted to do. And you can parallel that down to Turks and Caicos recently, where the governor came in and kicked the premier out.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was the power the governor had in those days. So the local politicians didn't, whichever political party or persuasion, didn't have that input into where the final say in government was. It was the governor.
Yeah.
And that's very important.
Yeah. To that point, Brent, and this is probably a good one for you. Your father was the leader of the UBP. And I think in general political context, particularly where a lot of the black Bahamians are concerned, sometimes UBP can be perceived with probably some negative connotations. But we've known your family, and we've seen so many of the values of your family that are very upstanding, have been helpful. You've talked about some of them, even in '64, and the contribution of Sir Roland to our own internal self-governance. How have you guys as a family reconciled, or how do you think about his leadership of the UBP and the context of that time to where we now live this fully integrated investment society where you guys have really outreached to be parts of commerce, where you've invited all shades and race and colors and creeds to be a part of our Bahamas? How have you guys thought about that?
I think you have to look at, first of all, as we started to say, the political parties only came into existence in 1959 or whatever. Dad was leader of government from 1954, if my memory serves me correct, in the House. So therefore we had that long, so it was a natural progression then to move into leadership of the FNM and then on to Premier. Now, in some of the cabinet meetings, there was no question it was heated. There were Stafford and Bobby, Norman Solomon, a number of them that had totally different views than my father did, our father did. I mean, if you read Jean Depuche's eulogy to my father, he said when Dad first approached him to run for politics, he said, we're burnished totally different avenues. He was a young, hardened, and here was this older, settled, and they came together, and Jean ended up doing the eulogy at the funeral. But that's, I think, where it happened. So the Bahamas. Then in 67, and then don't forget in 67, a number of people left. Stafford, Bobby, Dalbinas, a number of them. There were only a few that stayed. Our father, Jeff, John Stone, and a number of them. And then the second election happened, which
in 68,
where the stage was set.
Right.
And then it went on, and then the FNM came out of the free PLP.
Absolutely.
And when the PLP started falling to pieces in those early days, some of their members came out and formed
the FNM.
What was then the FNM.
Right.
And it went.
Yeah.
But even 67 was entirely pivotal, because you recall now, there was a gridlock, or with regards to the returns on election day or election count, and there had to be this understanding, because we're talking about the color, the racial divide. I think it's so important that you have Sir Alvin Brennan, you have Sir Roland Symonette, who are really sons of the soil.
Yeah,
same settlement.
That's right, sons of the soil. They came, and they're the two that truly sort of made this difference. Now, when you look at the other persons, without denigrating their contribution, those who left, I feel, and this is just my interpretation, did not have that full vested interest like the sons of the soil. I mean, you look at Sir Roland, he came up from the current. You look at Sir Alvin Brennan, he came up from the current. They were a minority in their day in terms of economics until they built themselves up themselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So they had a vested interest to be here.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yes, that'd be a correct statement, I think. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So, Loretta, I think I just want to ask this question. I think I've put both Craig and Brent on the spot about their role with the UBP and
I never voted UBP.
Neither did I.
Interesting. Good.
Too young.
Never voted DVP.
But people always ask, when you ran, you talked about Brent introducing you at your first campaign in 2001, and they would say, Granddaddy must be rolling over in his grave. Talk to us about how you think Symonette reconciled your move from the PLP to the FNN.
Well, first of all, let me just say this. I don't know if it was a stroke of genius on the part of former Prime Minister Ingram to have Brent introduce me, or whether it was Brent who insisted that he would introduce me. But
Not me.
it was, pardon?
Wasn't me.
Okay. So obviously there was someone that had an understanding of the historical significance of the families.
Yeah.
And that would have been someone who understood that. When that was sort of translated on the national political scene, remember now, we're one block away from Camp Road.
Yep.
People that I know very, very well on a very personal level, people that I would consider to have been friends, people who then looked at me as being a betrayer
Yep.
of the PLP values, but not knowing that what was instilled in us as children and grandchildren of Sir Milo was to be able to be educated, to be able to analyze things for ourselves and make our own determination. We were never taught that we had to be PLP.
Absolutely. Agreed.
We were never taught that we had to walk a certain road.
Absolutely.
Our grandparents, our parents insisted that we got a good education so that we could have a head on our shoulder. That's what they always said to us.
Absolutely.
Don't be no fool.
Absolutely.
And so for me, having been exposed, been off to the United States, to college and everything, having lived through that era of the Commission of Inquiry,
Yeah.
and
I can't recall.
all of the ramifications that one would have sort of taken away from that, I was able to make a determination for my self-actualization as to what I wanted to do.
Absolutely.
I did not have political aspirations.
Interesting.
But because I was so involved, I think, socially in our business and getting to know so many people across the islands of the Bahamas, I was then approached by Sylvia Scriven and Mr. Ingram about becoming involved in frontline politics. That was not my desire. And obviously, I would have been aligned with that. And remember now, just in the 84 era, when Ingram was kicked out of the PLP, he became the underdog.
Absolutely.
And Christie.
And Christie, that's right. He became the underdog. And I identified more so with that as I did with the status quo.
Yeah.
And so that was my decision. And when Brent introduced me, there was a lot of buzz that, we were actually bucking against the legacy of Sir Milo, but that was only for people who knew Sir Milo on a national political stage, who would not have known his values instilled in us.
Absolutely.
I'd like to make a
I'll
comment on
okay,
that, sorry.
Yeah.
So a very personal comment as it relates to Sir Milo and Sir Lyndon at the time. I was at school in England and just transferring to university in Canada. And around our dinner table one night, we had some guests and we were talking about that transition that you're asked about. And I made a comment to the guests, it's a very good thing that the politics changed in this country in 1967, because had it gone longer, I think, in my opinion, there would have been more violence or more active demonstration,
Yeah.
whereas it was very peaceful.
Yeah.
And I remember my father was very upset with me. But you can see what's happening, me being away at school and really not being I left in 1965 to go to England. So I missed a lot of this. And I remember him being particularly hurt or questioned me on why I would make a comment like that. I didn't realize I didn't mean any harm by it, but I just make the point that was the beginning of the transition in younger people.
Right.
Absolutely.
Thinking that it's a good thing. The change was good.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And it's just a personal comment I thought was relevant
No,
to
but
what
it
we were
also
talking
gave
about.
you a perspective outside of the fishbowl.
Absolutely.
That's better put, yes. Yeah,
I think
yeah.
it gave you that
Yeah,
perspective
yeah.
because once you're in the fishbowl, you don't see the entire picture. And you were away and you were able to see how things sort of...
The student revolution.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. What was going on around the world.
Yeah.
It wasn't all peaceful. I mean, in those days, you have to put up posters at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. And God help you if some of the,
get ripped out, too.
if some of the fellas found you, rocks were flying. I remember many a night in the Eastern Parade, bottles were flying at the speakers and rocks were flying
that's
and
true, but
everything else.
perhaps
Whereas
that's what
in my last election, I'd hang, we'd be on the same pole, hanging
for sure,
posters,
for sure.
and anyway, so it wasn't. It wasn't.
No, that is true. And you can talk about various areas. If you talk about going south through Wims's Bight or Greencastle, there were areas that we couldn't go.
I get you.
But and maybe that's what I was referring to. But I thought it was relevant that my father was hurt by this young kid saying this in his house.
Yeah.
But I'll go.
But it was the start of the change.
Yeah.
I remember
the change.
67, the night, because I was at home then. Dad was hurt by the change. Obviously, he thought they had got it right. The calling of the election in January was, the whole thing was a current mess. But the main point I'm making is he was fully cognizant that the time had come.
I see.
Maybe not in 67, but he was cognizant it was on its way and
that's true.
on its
That's
way.
true.
Got you.
Yeah.
And he was going to be whatever he could do to help it to get to there. Now, there were some others in his cabinet
They weren't
were
quite there
not
yet.
as comfortable with that. But he certainly was. If it wasn't this election, it'd be the next election.
Yeah.
That's really good to know.
Loretta mentioned that I introduced her in whenever it was, 2001.
2001.
In subsequent years, when the F&M did the boundary change, every government that did boundary change is lost.
Interesting. I didn't know.
If you go back and
Brent and I had to do some work there.
Yeah, so when we did the boundary change in the last time, Loretta took Montague.
That's right.
Which was my seat.
That's right.
I gave her Montague.
That's right. And I want you to say that.
I gave her Montague and I went into St. Anne's.
But
and she took it and ran with it.
No, but we also
I didn't know that.
had to make a strategic decision, if you recall, whether we were going to actually be able to get 2 seats or 1. The PLP had hoped we would only get 1 seat.
I see.
You remember that?
So I took St. Anne's.
That's right.
Interesting.
Which was not a traditional...
F&M stronghold.
Yeah, because I was going into Yamacraw.
I got
That's
you.
right.
I didn't know that.
And that is important for Brent to say. And we did have some little... But in the end, we got both of the seats.
Fantastic.
And that's because Brent is a strong candidate.
I'm no doubt about that. No doubt about that.
You were a very strong candidate too.
Yeah, but no, I mean, I think it's so important because once again, that was a collaborative effort. I remember even doing afterwards. I wanted to celebrate previous MPs, and we had a dinner, and Brent was like, "Yeah, you think you're getting me out of St. Anne's? getting me out of Montague?
She kicked me out of Montague. She would get me out of St. Anne's.
Yeah, that was funny.
But we said something about politics. Politics, certainly in the F&M, didn't mean you were a big tent of many different interests.
Got you.
And I heard Loftus Roker say he worked for Linden, and then you watch some of the family relationships in the PLP. When we sat around the cabinet table, there was a wide range of people. Mm-hmm. And Loretta would always put her as social services ministry. Then she would always put those issues forward, and you had to put them in the melting pot and come out with a policy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And and even in the recent administration, I mean, we had Denicio Diagla, and then you had the now leader Pintard. You had different opinions, Dion Folks, Carl Bethel, that aren't necessarily
aligned.
Yeah.
That is true. That is true.
Diametrically opposed, maybe sometimes might be better.
That is true.
So, Craig and Brent, if I could just take us back a little bit to talk about Mother B, Frances Butler, and Sir Roland. As I understand it, Sir Roland, how does this black woman who obviously was quite involved in civil society, how does she get, Sir Roland to really participate in all of her events and shed some light around what that relationship really looked like in a tangible way? Obviously, you talked about him, being asked to purchase all the remaining cakes and coffees after any fair or whatever. Share a little bit more light around, Sir Roland's relationship with
She probably picked up
Frances.
the phone.
Interesting.
Probably saw him at church.
Saw him at church.
Yeah.
But it was definitely, the two of them was two of them was not a demand. It was a what can we each do for each other.
Absolutely.
She had a big presence in that area.
Good.
And she did a lot of philanthropic work, and Dad was able to help her.
Fantastic.
And I think there was no questions asked. It got done. And I think, didn't she go on to do the Mothers Club?
She did?
She actually, because of her exposure.
And I think Dad helped quite a bit
That's right,
with
he
the
sure
Mothers
did.
Club.
That's right.
As a
The
result of
YWCA, the YMCA, the Silver Belts. It was all about national
right.
development.
Yeah, one led to the
It was
other.
all your grandmothers.
That's right. They were all about
Yeah.
national development. She'd been exposed on an international level after her husband had died,
Correct.
being in the United States of America, seeing the civil movements and everything. She was also a small-scale entrepreneur. So she had I think, once again, we got to go back to the church. I think that church foundation was so important. They were unified in that. They were both strong Methodists. So there was great mutual respect. And Sir Roland obviously was a successful businessman, and he was a politician. I don't think she had any compunction at all whatsoever with calling upon this successful man, who's her neighbor,
Absolutely.
to make sure, and her representative, really,
Well,
to
Frank
make
and
sure
Lorraine,
that
let me
this
ask
all
you,
happened.
how did she get to be a Methodist and the Butler family we think of as Anglican?
Loretta, that's one for you. You would have to bring a little context.
Well, I think Sir Milo, when he married our grandmother, because she would have been Anglican.
Right.
I'm thinking this is how this all came about. He would have become Anglican, and St. Matthew's Church, also in the pond, which is just a stone's throw away from Ebenezer,
300 yards apart.
But I think. Actually, they were originally Baptist somewhere along the way, if I'm not mistaken. But Mother Butler was a devout Methodist. Our grandfather would leave St. Matthew's Church during the singing of the last hymn every Sunday morning and walk over to Ebenezer to pay respects to her grave.
And Craig, now you say it might be the Thompson connection from a Lutheran.
From a Lutheran?
From a Lutheran. That might be the Methodist part.
Right.
That is the Methodist.
That's probably where the connection
interesting.
comes from.
Interesting.
Now that you say that.
Going back in time.
Yeah.
Because, the Lutheran adventurers
That's it.
actually brought the Methodism, and she was from Eleuthera.
Correct.
Yes.
So that's probably
her,
where that came from.
her and Sir Roland shared also an island lineage as well.
For sure.
So there were a lot of sort of parallels that they sort of built upon, if you will.
Yeah.
Because our father's plaque in the current church in Eleuthera, in the Methodist church in the current Eleuthera, I think one is 1866. That would have been our grandfather.
Yeah, that would be grandfather.
And our great-grandfather was 1843 or something. It goes back quite a long way, the Methodism in the current Eleuthera.
It traces your roots to the Loyalists, I
One was
imagine.
one was a preacher. Dad's father
That's right.
was a lay preacher.
Yeah.
So, guys, as we think about 50 years of independence, we think about the legacy of Sir Milo, Sir Roland. Chat about how you see. Let's chat about how we see, Sir Roland's legacy being honored in this whole process, and what else could we do? Because at the end, we have this colored, rich history, filled with ups and downs as times have changed. What else could we do to make sure that people know the story? I mean, because despite the political differences, I think there's a beautiful story of reconciliation.
Without question.
A beautiful story of how we've taken what was political adversaries or even nemesis, if people want to use that word, and found ways to, one, create great partnerships with strong, what I call religious connections. Mm-hmm. Secondly, deep economic and empowering vehicles, whether we think of Commonwealth Bank and all the other things from a family perspective. And 3 generations on, I think of your son, Craig, and your son, Brent, what I would consider friends of mine.
Sure.
And we continue to enjoy these great relationships when we come from this not so pleasant exchanges in history, but have certainly grown past that.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot, I think, for the country to take away from that as we think about race relations in our country, as we think about just politics as a whole.
And how do we form that for the next 50 years?
I think both of you deserve a lot of compliments on podcasts like this.
Yeah.
I mean, I said I've enjoyed watching the former podcasts, and I hope this one's seen in the same light. We've talked about the YPO group, talked about the church, the business ties. It is to the old time legacy groups. The feeling is definitely there.
Yeah.
It's beyond me. It's beyond my pay grade to decide the future, but it's something that we must keep our young people aware of.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to see perhaps some history books rewritten over the past 50 years that give a very tainted point of view of the past 60 years. But that's a relatively small point. I don't know. How do you feel, Brent?
Just stick
It's sort
a
of
pin there.
a deep question.
It's not.
I don't
It's
think
not
so
a small
politically as
point. It's
perhaps some
actually
people
a
do.
huge point
It's a huge
because
point.
I think that there was this entire post-colonialism where there was this anti-British, anti-white, anti-this, and that is a huge point. And I think it's also important, just as we are doing this podcast, to be fair and balanced in the
Absolutely.
way we see things. It is important that these stories are told so that people do not continue to walk away with the negative dictates that have been left. I think it's so important. So it's not a small point, especially when we're talking about being a united Bahamas.
Absolutely.
And being one that we respect and appreciate people of all hues. I mean, I find it very, very disheartening when my white Bahamian citizens, friends, say that, people tell them they must go back where they come from when they're every bit as Bahamian
as we are.
as I am.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, no, it's a huge part of the story.
So, Brent, you've probably experienced this so much differently than all of us, given your political
Yeah, I'm trying
experience.
to find a way to craft this so I don't appear offensive, whatever. Anyway, let's start. Let's go at it right ahead on. 67 was Majority Rule Day.
Yep.
We all know what that stood for. That was the black majority of the country taking over from the white minority.
Yep.
That's what it was. It's been billed as that since 1967. Clearly 100% racial. Now, if you look at the actual votes, they weren't too far off. It was 18-18. So Randolph went to be Minister of Labor. Alvin, who had a history with our father in Current, they were in business, went, and that created the
tiebreak.
the tiebreaker. And then really 68 was the big change because that's when a lot of people left. So we start off in 1967, and if I am a little personal on this, I'll be 100% personal. A lot of history only started in this country in 67.
Yeah.
We had roads, we had hospitals, we had airports, we had all kinds of things. But a lot of it started in 67. Now, that was the political spin doctors of the day. And so you're asking me, fast forward, I've had the same thing politically in my life. They say, well, that's because you're white, you're privileged, whatever. So there's still a very high degree of race in our politics.
Yep.
So if I may cut you for one moment, because I think people don't quite understand the tongue-in-cheek comment that you made at the start about majority rule. Just to be very clear, majority rule is about the democratic process.
No question.
The democratic process of those winning the majority of the votes get to govern.
Correct.
And what you're saying is that historically, because the majority of the population was black, the story is skewed in such a way that it was like, oh, okay, the blacks have overcome the whites, which is not what majority rule is about. Majority rule is about the democratic process of one man, one vote, and those that get the majority
I disagree
wins.
with you. I disagree with you. I see where you're coming from, because don't forget, women didn't have the right to vote. You had the land vote, and we moved on to that. 62 was an election where we had universal
suffrage,
and then we went on to 67. But in the political world, that is being skewed as a very racially charged day.
I got you.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
No, and we need to make sure
And
that
we went from there. Okay, we went from there to a period where 68, and then I think the UBP had 4 or 6 people in Parliament. Majority of them were white, and from periods in there, it was a very racially charged time. Put a pin in that. I want to ask the question, and maybe, everyone will heckle me for this one, but have we gone anywhere in 50 years? Let's write it. And hopefully someone does what have we achieved in independence, which has moved that ball field? Election time is a common thing. Roots was always played. Race became an issue.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll stop there, but I'll come back. One of the issues we were talking about was whether or not our father has been recognized. I was on Tucker Road the other day doing something, and a lot of people came up to me and said, "Your father helped me here," or "Your father did this for me." But in the dark days when they were attacking him, and the dark days when they were attacking me, no one picked up the phone and called and said hello, or even got on the public platform. So one day my father called the Batelco and got this really nice girl, and he wrote the management of Batelco, this is after 67, and said, Jane Doe is very helpful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She should be complimented. A couple of days later, this lady comes to see you and says, Mr. Symonette, I need a job. He said, where were you working before? He said, I'm the lady you wrote to Batelco to say that I did a good job. I no longer have a job.
Wow.
She then came to work for us. I think worked for us for a number of years.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So we have, sometimes the untold story.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are
I
other
heard the story
untold
about
stories.
the hunter and the lion.
Yeah.
There are other untold stories about your dad, because when you look at their contribution to the Baptist community in particular, I always say that, I think it's the church and, the godliness of Sir Roland and people of that generation. Sir Roland, people like Prince Hepburn and all of them, they can tell the story of his massive contribution to their church building, the big one on Blue Hill Road, Market Street. I mean, I don't remember the pardon?
Dr. McPhee.
Dr. McPhee and those, those are churches that, even though they weren't Methodist, Sir Roland actually did so much. And then, of course, the camps that they developed through all of that for the children, the summer camps and what have you. I think that
we have to get the story in about the youth camp now.
Absolutely.
When Brent will have to correct me when I go wrong, but on our front porch, my father had all of the denominations at the time.
Interesting.
Again, I'm talking about 78, 77.
And this is important.
And said, now listen, I'd like to make a contribution to a youth camp in the Bahamas. And it turned out that the Christies had land and my father had land, our father had land right in the James Siston area, which geographically is the center of the Bahamas, approximately. So he thought we'd put this youth camp here, and he built the youth camp and had the female dormitory, the male dormitory, a big dining and classroom wing, library up top. It's still there. James Siston, if you ever go behind James Siston on the north side, you'll see it. And he couldn't get the religions to all agree to run it.
Interesting.
It fell apart, never worked. And it turned out it's now being run by a lovely group from Georgia.
That's right. They had the foreigners come in and actually run this
part
camp.
of the Methodists.
But it's just one story of our history that perhaps not many people know.
Yeah. And I think it's important because when you talk about the contribution of Sir Roland, you see that he had a true vested interest in his country, in the future of his country, with the children, because those camps, they were well organized, and children left New Providence each year to go to have this family island experience.
Whale Key, it started in Whale Key.
Absolutely. Yeah. And those are things that were very, very important that we do not tell the story about. Yeah. But of course, I know about it because of our involvement, and people sometimes don't talk about it.
And I think a lot of times we do things anonymously, or we don't talk about it because of it may open another avenue.
Yeah.
I mean, I know in business people have their picture, they're giving a check to Ranfley Homes or something because it's economically, for some of us doing that, it just says, that's another one to add to my list to ask. Yeah. So there is a lot of times when things are done anonymously because of circumstances. Yeah. Whatever.
Well, I think it's important, that we get on the record, especially on what we're trying to achieve in this legacy podcast, we want to tell the whole story. We want to tell the truth. We want to be able to encourage other people to understand that there is nothing wrong in doing good.
Absolutely.
And there are persons who have done good that we have not recognized.
Absolutely.
And that this is the only way we're truly going to build a stronger and better Bahamas over the next 50 years and beyond.
And what is good to one person, someone else might disagree with.
Absolutely.
But at the time, I mean, there are times when we were in cabinet that we made decisions that you can look back and say, why did we do that? But we had to make them on the basis of the information that was presented to us at that time.
Absolutely.
So being a Monday morning quarterback is great. But when you have to make that decision in politics, in life, in business, you have to do it to the best of your ability at that time.
That is true.
Yeah, that's
that
true.
is really true.
And so we should judge people on that basis.
On that, I agree. So listen, it's been, I think a great conversation. Certainly want to, thank you both, Brent and Craig, for joining us. Thank you, Loretta, as always, for being such a wonderful host. I got one final question is, listen, I am third generation. Cameron, who is not here, would have been third generation. We still know of multiple generations of the Symonette group or the various Symonette enterprises from shipbuilding to now Butlers and food and distribution. I just want us to close with one nugget to inspire other families who are thinking about how do they create multi-generational businesses. Perhaps think about recognizing that, race is actually a thing that can be leveraged because the commonality of what I call the rebels of Sir Roland and Sir Milo is actually what has created what some people may call dynasties, one white, one black, but all Bahamians. What is that one nugget, maybe Craig, Brent, Loretta, you would leave with our audiences before we wrap up?
I think to anyone as a family or legacy, it's a big challenge, but I would point someone towards youth and sports. I think those are the two events that galvanize our society. Whatever sport you're talking about, or whatever youth group you're talking about, but if you had to make a contribution in one area, the area that I would focus on would be youth and sports.
Awesome.
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I only have one word: hard work.
Absolutely.
2 words.
Yeah.
Whatever it is,
Yeah.
it's hard work, and it started with our forefathers who worked hard, and it doesn't come easy. If you want to succeed in whatever you feel, whether it's sports, business, it's not wake up at 10 o'clock and leave the office at 2.
Absolutely.
It's hard work.
And I
That's
have
true.
seen that I can attest to that with Brent in particular, even in his, what we consider retirement. But having said that, I think it's also important to remember that, we should not go outside of our comfort zone. In order to achieve that next big goal, be a little bit uncomfortable and reach out across, the political divide, the social divide, the color divide. Let's unify ourselves.
Absolutely.
No question.
And just getting back to what Craig has talked about with youth and sport, I see him actually living that every day.
Absolutely.
And I would like to commend you. Maybe sometimes you all don't want to toot your own horns. And I understand, there's a lot of modesty, but in modesty also people lose the big picture. The whole sailing camp that's going on in Eleuthera right now,
Yes,
I
that's been
think
very
is
successful.
very, very important. I commend the government for making sailing now our national sport.
Yep.
But, the Symonettes have always kept that historical maritime aspect of their history in the forefront. And now it's paid off because you see sailing is now that national sport. So thank you for what you're doing in Eleuthera.
Thank you.
Maybe one day you'll teach me how to sail as well. But no,
I'll
I
accept
think
that challenge.
yeah, I think that is so important.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Thank you
you.
guys so much,
Thank you very
Craig and
much.
Brent. I think the perspective that you added, we hope leaves our guests with something to think about. Oftentimes, this issue of race in our country, the political change that we've gone through over 50 years, can often leave people with bitter wounds. And our hope is to really get people to recognize that there's a bridge that we can build or we can choose to tear down. I think certainly as families, both legacy families, we've sought to build bridges. And I invite our audience to continue to, let's build bridges as we think about celebrating 50 years of independence, because our country is better off. There's a lot more value to create. There's a lot more lives to empower. But before we wrap up, Loretta, I want you to thank our sponsors.
First of all, I just want to thank you, my brilliant cousin, for how you bring it all together. You're absolutely brilliant, and I commend you. I then want to really take this opportunity to say that I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you two Symonette friends. It has been, we weren't afraid to touch on things that can perhaps be a little controversial, but it's so important that we did it. I would like to just close out by saying thank you so much to Echo Gallery at Bahamas for sponsoring this show. We love this space and we're so grateful to you. And of course, to the Butler Legacy Foundation, also sponsoring this show. And we invite those of you who enjoy this show that if you'd like to be a sponsor, we're open to sponsorship as well. Thank you very much, our guests. You have been phenomenal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta. Thank you, Franklin.
Thank you.
Thank you.